Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share this podcast with them. In the summer of 1863, a single campaign decided the future of a divided nation. It determined whether the United States would endure or collapse into two rival nations. Had the outcomes shifted ever so slightly, the Union may have fractured forever, and the ripple effects would have reshaped the modern world. A weaker America, a divided continent, and a global balance of power unrecognizable to us today. But for the men who fought it, the stakes were far more personal. Thousands marched into the fire, knowing full well the hell that awaited them. Artillery ripping through the ranks, rifle balls thudding into flesh. Brothers and friends falling in heaps of blood-soaked earth. They endured the chaos and the carnage, not for glory, but for something greater. The hope that their sacrifices would matter, that the lives they gave would build a nation worth saving. As a battle, this was a test of leadership, of endurance, and raw determination. The United States that emerged would go on to shape the 20th and 21st centuries, influencing politics, economies, and wars across the globe. But it all hinged on this moment. To understand the world we live in, we must look back to this campaign, to its victories and failures, and to the men whose decisions and whose deaths changed everything. Let's now experience the Battle of Gettysburg.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 85, The Battle of Gettysburg, the 1st through the 3rd of July, 1863. Union forces, roughly 115,000 men. Confederate forces, roughly 76,000 men. Gettysburg was the high water mark of the Confederacy, the deepest penetration into Union soil Lee's army would ever achieve. For 3 days, the fate of the war hung in balance on those Pennsylvania hills, and the Confederate dream of victory seemed tantalizingly close. But in the end, Lee's Gambl failed, and his shattered army limped back across the Potomac. The price had been steep, and the consequences enormous. For the Union, the victory came like a lifeline. It steadied a nation growing weary of bloodshed and doubt, shoring up both morale and political unity when Lincoln needed it most. Northern resolve, so close to breaking, found new strength in the carnage of Gettysburg. The defeat robbed the Confederacy of its momentum and stripped away the illusion of invincibility that surrounded Lee's army. From this moment on, the tide of war would flow north to south, and the Union, though battered, would not turn back.
From the moment Robert E. Lee seized command of Confederate forces in June of 1862, his reputation grew with every passing battle. On home soil, Lee's army seemed untouchable, a wall of bayonets and unrelenting grit that Union generals slammed against only to fall back, bloodied and humiliated. True, Lee's first foray into Northern Territory ended in failure at Antietam Creek in September of 1862, where his army was forced to turn back at Sharpsburg, Maryland. But defeat barely scratched the veneer of his legend. Union generals came and went, each one promising victory, and each one soundly outmatched, outmaneuvered, and sent scurrying back across the Potomac. On Southern soil, Lee's aura of invincibility only grew stronger. Yet even as Lee's men secured their hard-won victories, they paid a heavy price. The Army of Northern Virginia was starving. Shoes were in tatters, ammunition and rations dwindled. Lee was defending the Confederacy, yes, but his men fought with empty bellies and wore uniforms that were threadbare shadows of their former selves. By June of 1863, Lee had made up his mind. He would march north once more, straight into Union territory, and this time it would not be to defend, but to strike back. Lee's reasons were practical and urgent. By living off the bounty of northern farms and factories, he could give the scarred earth of Virginia a chance to breathe, to recover, and to feed his soldiers once more. Strategically, Lee aimed higher still. By wreaking havoc in Pennsylvania, pillaging farms, severing railroads, and sowing chaos, he hoped to turn Northern opinion against Abraham Lincoln. A peace movement was rising, and Lee meant to stoke its fire until it threatened to topple the Union government itself. And though faint, Lee still held to a final hope: to once more catch the eyes of Europe. Diplomats in London and Paris had made it clear they would not support the Confederacy unless it proved itself on Northern soil. Lee understood this. One decisive victory, and he could show the world that the Confederacy was not just surviving, but it was winning. Antietam had cast doubt on the South's viability, but Lee believed a triumph in the summer of 1863 could still shift the tide. Foreign recognition, foreign aid. These were the elusive prizes Lee hoped to seize with blood and with steel. Meanwhile, President Abraham Lincoln looked on with growing frustration and worry. The Army of the Potomac, tasked with crushing Lee's forces, had failed him time and time again. Lincoln had cycled through generals like a desperate gambler swapping cards. None could deliver the victory he needed. Richmond, the Confederate capital, remained untaken, and each failure wore Lincoln's patience thinner. These generals lacked the resolve Lincoln demanded. After each bitter defeat, they abandoned ground, falling back to Washington, D.C., heads hung low, and their armies in total disarray. Out west, though, Major General Ulysses S. Grant was carving his name into history with a series of relentless victories. In Tennessee and along the Mississippi River, Grant's star rose higher with each battle. Now he laid siege to Vicksburg, the last Confederate stronghold linking the Deep South to the western states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. Yet the eyes of the Northern public remained fixed on Virginia, and there Lee reigned. Each Confederate victory fed the growing peace movement in the North, a movement that whispered of surrender and questioned the cost of Lincoln's war. Lincoln's hold on power was tenuous at best. A crushing defeat on Union soil would embolden his opponents and could unleash a backlash that would shake his presidency to its foundation. In early May of 1863, Lee had crushed Major General Joseph Hooker's army at Chancellorsville in a victory so decisive it sent shockwaves through the North. The triumph confirmed what Lee already knew. His army was at the pinnacle of its fighting strength. These men were hardened, disciplined, and they were ready for whatever lay ahead. And so, in late June, Lee led 76,000 men northward. They left Virginia, tramped through Maryland's reluctant and resentful countryside, and crossed into southern Pennsylvania, a hostile land ripe for plunder and ripe for conquest. Lee's sights were set on a prize of strategic importance: the East-West Railroad at Harrisburg, a vital artery pumping supplies into the Union war effort. Cut the rail line, and he would wound the enemy deeply. To sustain his campaign, Lee scattered parts of his army across the Pennsylvanian countryside to scour the farms, the mills, and the granaries for much-needed supplies. It was one of these foraging units that would fire the very first shots of a battle neither side had planned, but both would remember forever. Word soon reached Lee that the Union Army was close, closing in faster than expected. So wasting no time, he ordered his dispersed forces to converge on a small Pennsylvania town whose name would soon echo through history: the town of Gettysburg. Gettysburg itself held little strategic value, but it did contain something Lee's men desperately needed: shoes. An infantry brigade moved swiftly to seize the town, for many of Lee's soldiers marched with bare feet on blistered, bloody ground. Meanwhile, President Lincoln had once again turned the reins of the Army of the Potomac over to a new man, Major General George Gordon Meade. On June 28th, Meade took command, an appointment as abrupt as it was desperate. Meade wasted no time. His troops were fanning out across the countryside, searching for signs of Lee's whereabouts. It was one of these probing units, a cavalry brigade, that arrived in Gettysburg. On the morning of July 1st, 1863, the two forces collided near Gettysburg in what began as an accidental clash, an encounter born of circumstance that spiraled into a storm of musket fire and blood. Union cavalry, under the command of Brigadier General John Buford, positioned themselves west of Gettysburg, blocking the road from Chambersburg. They were ready when Confederate forces under General A.P. Hill came into view. For 2 hard-fought hours, Buford's outnumbered men held their ground, firing volley after volley to slow Hill's advance. But when Confederate reinforcements under General Richard Ewell swept down from the north, the pressure became too great. Buford's men fell back, retreating through the town itself, their resistance buying precious time for the Union Army. The Union troops regrouped on higher ground just south of Gettysburg, on a stretch of earth known as Cemetery Ridge. It was there, on that commanding position, that the next phase of the battle would take shape. Lee understood the significance instantly. Meade's army was closing in, and that high ground, Cemetery Ridge, could not be left in Union hands. To lose it would mean to surrender the battlefield's most critical advantage. But Lee's command to General Ewell was vague, a single phrase that would haunt the Confederacy. Quote, "Take the ridge, if practicable," end quote. Ewell was a capable officer, but he had been given an impossible role, replacing the irreplaceable General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Lee's most brilliant subordinate had been killed at Chancellorsville, and his absence loomed large over the Confederate command. Jackson's death was a crippling blow, and Ewell, for all his ability, was no Jackson. Where Jackson would have seized the moment with furious purpose, Ewell hesitated. Many historians, then and now, argue that had Stonewall Jackson been alive that day, the Confederate Army might have smashed the Union line before it had a chance to solidify, ending the battle on July 1st as a Southern victory. But Ewell faltered. His chance slipped away, and with it, the possibility of an easy Confederate triumph. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon on July 1st, Union reinforcements were flooding onto Cemetery Ridge. They dug in, fortified their line, and prepared for the storm that they knew was coming. Lee's men took up positions on Seminary Ridge, a line of high ground running parallel to the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, a mile to the east. From there, Lee surveyed the battlefield, pondering his next move with the cool, methodical calculation of a seasoned commander. Lee's sharp eye quickly assessed the ground before him. Cemetery Ridge was now bristling with Union strength, and Culp's Hill at its northern end appeared no less formidable. With the Union center and right heavily fortified, Lee turned his attention to the left flank. There, he believed, lay his opportunity to break the enemy line. Lee devised a 2-pronged strategy. While his main blow fell on the Union left, a demonstration against Culp's Hill on the Union right would tie down Meade's troops. If Meade pulled men from Culp's Hill to reinforce his left, the demonstration could become a full assault, exploiting the weakened flank. Lee turned to Major General James Longstreet, his most trusted lieutenant, and a man whose battlefield instincts rivaled any commander of the war. It was Longstreet who would lead the assault on the Union left. Yet Longstreet was uneasy. He had argued adamantly for a different approach. Move south, he urged. Swing around Meade's flank and threaten Washington itself. Such a maneuver would pull Meade off of his high ground and force him to attack on ground of Lee's choosing, where Confederate defenses would shatter the Union assault. Longstreet had learned a hard truth in this war. The side that stood on the defensive, that forced its enemy to attack across open ground into prepared positions, usually emerged victorious. His proposal was simple, brilliant, and proven. Move south, dig in, and let Meade come to them. The Union Army would be forced to cross open fields into a hail of Confederate fire, a killing ground. But Lee dismissed the idea. He would not maneuver. He would attack. Longstreet, though unconvinced, obeyed. Grimly, he moved his men into position on the Union left flank. What followed has been the subject of fierce debate ever since that fateful July 2nd, 1863. Lee wanted the assault launched early, striking the Union position before it could fully harden. But for reasons that remain murky, delays, miscommunication, perhaps even hesitation, the attack didn't begin until 4 p.m. On the Union side, Major General Daniel Sickles commanded the left flank. In a move that was as rash as it was disastrous, Sickles abandoned the high ground on Cemetery Ridge and advanced his men nearly half a mile forward. His new position was a salient, unsupported, exposed, and vulnerable to attack. Longstreet's troops advanced into position, found that the Union left was not where they expected it to be. Sickles' ill-conceived advance had created an entirely new battlefield, and Longstreet adjusted accordingly. Behind Sickles' precarious line loomed Little Round Top, an unoccupied hill that commanded a devastating view of the Union position. If the Confederates could seize it, artillery placed there would tear the Union flank apart. A swift move on Little Round Top might have turned the tide of the entire battle, but Longstreet's orders were clear. Engage the Union Army, not seize the hill. Longstreet, having already failed to sway Lee toward a defensive strategy, resolved to follow his orders to the letter. Whether out of frustration, out of discipline, or resignation, he pressed forward as instructed. As Longstreet's men surged into battle, Union officers recognized the threat. In an act of extraordinary foresight, they rushed Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Infantry Regiment to the crest of Little Round Top. By the time Longstreet's troops smashed through Sickles' line, the window of opportunity had closed. Little Round Top was no longer empty. It was bristling with Union bayonets and Union cannon. If Longstreet had moved with greater speed or seized Little Round Top at the first chance, Lee's army might well have won the battle that day. Instead, the opportunity slipped through Confederate fingers, lost forever. As the sun fell on July 2nd, Lee's army had struck hard, but they failed to break the Union flanks. That night, Lee gathered his staff to decide the next move. Lee determined to finish what he had begun, resolved to stay and fight. His plan, bold in its simplicity, now seems reckless in hindsight. Lee believed the Union center had been stretched thin, its flanks hammered relentlessly through the day, and he saw his chance. He would commit 10,000 fresh troops to a full frontal assault against Cemetery Ridge, the beating heart of the Union line. If his men could punch through, the Union army would collapse like a rotted beam under pressure. This assault, an action that would be immortalized as Pickett's Charge, was not meant to be a standalone effort. Lee envisioned it as the spearhead, a thrust that would rip open the Union center, allowing follow-up waves to pour through and shatter the enemy entirely. Lee's plan, however, flew in the face of a brutal truth of the war. The defense always held the advantage. Meade had reinforced his lines overnight, bringing in fresh troops to strengthen his already formidable position. Lee's assumption that the Union center was weakened proved catastrophically wrong. Longstreet, who was always a pragmatist, once again implored Lee to maneuver south, to flank Meade's left, and force him into the open. But again, Lee refused. His orders were unwavering. Longstreet would lead Pickett's division, supported by two of A.P. Hill's divisions, fewer than 15,000 men, across 3/4 of a mile of open ground. Their objective? To smash into entrenched Union infantry, backed by unrelenting artillery fire. Longstreet, resigned but deeply troubled, reportedly said what others dared not. Quote, "General Lee, there never was a body of 15,000 men who could make that attack successfully." End quote. Lee's decision to proceed remains one of the most debated moments in military history. Lee's faith in his men was absolute. These were veterans, hardened by years of victory and battle, soldiers whose morale and experience were unmatched. Some modern scholars suggest that Lee may have been unwell, possibly suffering from heart trouble, perhaps even a mild heart attack in the preceding days. His judgment, therefore, clouded by physical strain. Or perhaps it was simply overconfidence, faith taken too far, a gamble Lee believed his men could win. On July 3rd, just after 1 p.m., Confederate artillery roared to life. For 2 hours, the air shook as hundreds of guns unleashed hell upon the Union line. a bombardment meant to soften the defenses and pave the way for Pickett's men. But the bombardment fell short of its mark. The Confederate guns fired blindly into smoke and distance, while the Union artillery, well-positioned and disciplined, held its ground. Little real damage was done. At 3 p.m., the signal came and the Confederate line stepped off. Across a mile of open ground, Pickett's men advanced. Thousands of gray-clad soldiers, bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun. For 20 long minutes, they marched in perfect formation, an awe-inspiring display of courage and of discipline. And then came the thunder. The Union guns, silent until now, erupted with murderous fury. Shells exploded, ripping massive gaps in the Confederate ranks. Men fell by the dozens, but the lines closed and kept moving, undaunted. At 200 yards, Union rifles opened fire. A storm of lead joined the artillery's roar, shredding the advancing troops. The air filled with smoke, screams, and the whistle of bullets. Yet still they came. Across the blood-soaked fields, through fences and fire, they closed on the Union line. The very earth seemed to resist them, but their will pushed them forward. And for a brief, brutal moment, the Confederate soldiers broke through. Hand-to-hand combat erupted, bayonets thrust, rifle butts swung. Men fought with fists, teeth, and raw desperation. A second wave might have tipped the scales, but that second wave never came. By the time the Confederates reached the crest of the ridge, they were too few. The Union line held firm. The broken remnants of Pickett's division had no choice but to turn and retreat, stumbling back across the same deadly ground, under the same unrelenting fire. Of the 15,000 men who began the charge, nearly 7,500 were killed, wounded, or captured, left strewn across the field, a grim testament to Lee's Gambl. The next day, July 4th, the army stared across the battlefield at one another, silent and spent. Neither side had the will to renew the slaughter. That night, under the cover of a driving rainstorm, Lee began his retreat. The proud army of Northern Virginia pulled back from Seminary Ridge and crossed the Potomac River, returning to the south. Major General George Meade, victorious yet ever cautious, chose not to pursue. He stood on Cemetery Ridge as Lee's shattered army slipped away. Had Meade pushed forward, the swollen Potomac River would have trapped Lee's army like an anvil awaiting the hammer blow. A relentless pursuit might have crushed Lee's forces entirely, perhaps ending the war within days. In the end, the Union Army did what it so often did: won the field, but failed to seize the moment. Lee escaped, bloodied but intact, his army still able to fight another day. On that very same day, hundreds of miles away, Ulysses S. Grant stood at Vicksburg, accepting the surrender of the city and its garrison. The Mississippi River, at last, belonged to the Union, cutting the Confederacy in two. The South's western states, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, were now isolated. Grant's victory delivered a mortal wound to the Confederacy's hopes of survival. Had Meade pursued Lee to the Potomac and destroyed his battered army, the Confederate government would likely have faced the unthinkable: total defeat. They would have been forced to sue for peace. And so, while Gettysburg marked a great victory for the Union, it was not the decisive blow it could have been. Opportunity slipped away into the mist, as it so often did in this long, grueling war. The real significance of Gettysburg lies not in Union success, but in Confederate failure. Had Lee triumphed, his legend would have grown to mythic proportions. Meade, like so many before him, would have been dismissed, a name added to the list of failed commanders. Lee's plan to live off the fertile fields of the North would have restored his starving army, while terrorizing the countryside could have weakened Lincoln's already fragile administration. A Confederate victory at Gettysburg might have reignited interest in European capitals, where diplomats had grown wary of backing a failing cause. But Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation issued on January 1st, 1863, had reframed the war as a fight against slavery. Any nation recognizing the Confederacy now would be seen as endorsing a slave-holding government. Public opinion across Europe, particularly in Britain and France, now weighed heavily against slavery. Recognizing the Confederacy in the face of the Union's moral crusade would have sparked outrage among their own people. Yet in the end, it was Northern public opinion that mattered most. Even with Grant's success at Vicksburg, the peace movement in the North was growing, fueled by exhaustion and the mounting cost of the war. A defeat at Gettysburg might have pushed Lincoln to make drastic concessions. A victory at Gettysburg could have opened the road to Washington, D.C., and Lee knew it. Washington was ringed with formidable defenses, but the psychological blow would have been devastating. The sight of Lee's army advancing in triumph, fresh from routing the Army of the Potomac, might have forced the government to flee. And if Washington fell, Lee's victory could have tipped Maryland, a slave state with strong Confederate sympathies, into the Southern camp. Such a shock might have reverberated westward, pushing Missouri and Kentucky, wavering states on the fault line of war, to join the Confederacy. Thus, Gettysburg's significance lies in what could have been. The battle marked the turning point, not just because Lee failed, but because a Confederate victory carried staggering implications. It would have altered the war and history itself in ways impossible to measure. Though Gettysburg was over, the war dragged on for nearly 2 more years. Its outcome no longer in doubt, but bought at a terrible cost. For the Union, Gettysburg became a symbol of endurance, and for the South, a harbinger of inevitable defeat. And yet it was a victory marred by missed opportunities. Lee's failure preserved the Union, but Meade's caution ensured the war continued. When paired with Grant's triumph at Vicksburg, Gettysburg slammed the door shut on Southern hopes of recognition or victory, though neither side could see it clearly at the time. The ground at Gettysburg, once quiet farmland, had been turned to blood and ruin. The cost was measured in tens of thousands of dead, dying, and broken men. The legacy of that battle still echoes today, a reminder of the razor's edge upon which history turns.